I'm Lori Rogers-Stokes. I'm a member of the Partnership of the Historic Bostons, your sponsor tonight, and very grateful hosts for our three speakers who are going to talk to us about this campaign. And I'm going to get right to it because I know you want to hear from them. We have three speakers joining us and sharing their time with us. Elizabeth Solomon, an enrolled member and elder of the Massachusett Tribe at Ponkapoag. Ms. Solomon has a long-standing commitment to Indigenous rights and community building, and in this capacity, she often speaks about local Indigenous issues, and she serves on multiple advisory and management boards. Brittany Wally is a Nipmuc tribal member, and her advocacy work has included representing Nipmuc people, and she has served as a representative of the Nipmuc during the work of the Special Commission on the official seal and motto of the Commonwealth. And she has other advocacy work as a public speaker, a member of the Massachusetts Mascot Steering Committee, and as a weaver. We have David Detmold, who is the founding editor of the weekly independent newspaper, The Montague Reporter, in Montague, Massachusetts. And he has served for 20 years as a member of the representative town meeting of Montague. And since 2018, he has coordinated the changethemassflag.com website. So that is 5 years now and running. So we see that our three guests tonight have long experience with this issue of working to change what is on our state seal, which you may not notice until you are maybe driving down the highway and you see some highway signs. And so if you've heard a little bit about this, but wondered what it was really about, or if it's new to you, you're going to learn a lot tonight. And we're very grateful to have our speakers here to teach us about it. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to them. Oh, and we'll take questions at the end. They're going to speak for, maybe 45 minutes, 60 minutes, somewhere in there. And then we will have Q&A at the end. If you have a question at any time, put it in the chat. I guarantee we will get to it, even if you put it in the chat early on. So that's how we'll handle the questions. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Solomon. I'm an elder of the Massachusett Tribe at Ponkapoag. And in forums like this, I usually start with an acknowledgement of land and peoples. We are gathered this evening in native space. Those of you in the greater Boston area are in native space and on the traditional lands of the Massachusett Tribe. Those of you joining us from other parts of Eastern Massachusetts may be on the traditional lands of the Nipmuc or the Wampanoag. However, please know that wherever you are in Massachusetts, New England, or anywhere in the Americas, you are in native space and there are native people who belong to that place. Wherever you live, I ask you to treat our lands and waters as something precious, because they are. 10,000 years ago, Boston Harbor was dry land, and we were here. 1,000 years ago, much of what is now known as the city of Boston was underwater, and we were here. 400 years ago, English colonists came to occupy our land, and we were here. Today, most of Greater Boston is a major urban area occupied by others, and still we are here. We remember what is now dry land when it was water, and we remember what is now water when it was dry land. We know the landscape will change again, and we are preparing. We remember those who came before us. Here is where we laughed, cried, loved, made music, practiced our beliefs, shared both food and knowledge, and made both useful and sacred things. Here is where we raised our children and buried and honored our dead. Here is where we interacted with people who came from across oceans. These interactions brought new things, new tensions, new ideas, new challenges. Here is where some of the visitors brought diseases that killed most of our people, leaving those of us who were left behind bereft. Here is where those of us who survived remained and continued to make our lives. Here is where English colonists began their conquest of the continent. Here is where our relationships with the colonists were built, destroyed, and built again. Some of these relationships were friendly and beneficial. Others were fraught with conflict, sadness, and loss. Here's where we use new literacy and knowledge to advocate for our people. And here is where the language of our ancestors was forcefully taken from us. Here is where those who came to live among us saw land, resources, and sometimes people as commodities to be bought and sold. Here is where we maintained, sometimes in secret, our commitment to our own values and beliefs about the nature of the world, the land, and people. Here is where we made alliances, intermarried, and made new communities with people from other Native groups and with those from other cultures. Here is where we continue to make our lives. Here is where we laugh, cry, love, make music, practice our beliefs, share both food and knowledge, and make both useful and sacred things. Here is where we raise our children and bury and honor our dead. Here is where we prepare the way for those to come. When Indigenous communities in the United States gather together, they traditionally acknowledge and honor the ancestral holders of the land they are meeting on. Many non-Native communities have begun to incorporate this practice in public events, both to honor the Native peoples who belong to the land and to recognize that the use of the lands by others has come as a result of the displacement of the land's original holders. But I challenge non-Native peoples and institutions to go beyond verbal land acknowledgements and to consider what it might really mean to honor Native space. Honoring Native space means acknowledging that everything we do has an effect well beyond our individual lives, that our actions necessarily resonate throughout the larger environment. It means considering our conduct with its broad consequences in mind. Honoring the land means honoring the entire space that we are part of. It acknowledges that all we do, even the breaths we take, have effects well beyond our bodies. So I honor all of the directions. I honor the land, I honor the water, I honor the sky, I honor the sun and the moon and the stars. I honor all the living and non-living things that share this space with us. I honor the ancestors who came before me and those who will come after me. I honor everything that now lives with respect within this space. We're here to consider the state seal and motto, which are currently inextricably linked with the initial colonization of what is now known as the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The central figure is a Native man dressed in the clothing that the designers associated with 17th century Native dress. The sword above the head is meant to represent the sword of the early colonist Miles Standish. The shield is an artifact of medieval European war heraldry. The motto references peace by the sword, and the name of the Commonwealth was taken from a Native nation. But while the images on the seal reference colonization, we must remember that this has always been a Native space, and there are indigenous histories of this place that span thousands of years. These histories underlie the better known narratives of the last 400 years of this place. So while there are images in the current seal that reference Native people, none of them reflect these underlying Native histories that persist, like layers of land just below the surface. Crucially, do not imagine that colonization of this place was something that happened and was completed centuries ago, or that it is currently limited to certain peoples, places, or practices. The systems that resulted in the colonization of this land and its people are still in place. The colonization of this place and others continues, and we are all complicit in this continued colonization. As you listen to the speakers today, I ask you to think about whose narratives the current seal and motto reflect, who is served by those narratives, and if these are the stories we want to tell about ourselves and to the larger world. May all that we do in Native spaces both honor the land and prepare the way for all of those to come. Thank you. And now I turn it over to Brittany Hawley.
Kabatne Karabaramish Elizabeth. I always like to take a moment because it's very powerful what we just got to listen to, and I hope that that resonates with everyone. Wanikisak, Natisuas Brittany Pi Winnipeg Wally. Good day, my name is Brittany Littleleaf Wally, and in tonight's talk about the Massachusetts state flag, we're going to cover what has happened, what has led us to this point in time, and we're also talking about why we are where we are and how it's not where we want to land. So I think it's very important that we keep in the forefront of our minds how we want to move forward, what it is that we're trying to do and where we're trying to go, and who's coming with us. We encourage everyone not to lose sight of the aspirational aspect of it all. Moving away from the current imagery creates an opportunity for us as a community in the Commonwealth to ask, how do we want to represent ourselves? Embedded in this question are two more subtle questions, one being how do we want to represent ourselves to ourselves, and the other being how do we want to represent ourselves externally to others. This line of inquiry may seem simplistic, but I've often found that in large efforts towards making change, especially when something that people consider to be historic is being evaluated, during these efforts, the most grounded and direct questions can be overlooked. So speaking of something that is very direct, what is a seal? So if you were to look into various dictionary definitions, you get all kinds of things. But in our context, we're thinking about things like a device that would create some kind of raised emblem, an embossment, imagery that's related to a signature to authenticate something, a symbol of something being official, and of course, something that represents you. The imagery associated with the state of Massachusetts is a series of concentric things. So our state seal features our state coat of arms in the same way that our flag features the seal. So in other words, we actually see the state coat of arms in the state seal on the state flag. That's currently how the Mass General Law is set up. So for clarification, if we're talking about the flag, the seal, or the coat of arms in this specific moment in time, it indicates that we're talking about the same imagery with the exception of where the actual state motto pops up. Well, what does this mean? It means that the native imagery is within a coat of arms. So another question we might want to ask ourselves is, what exactly is a coat of arms? Well, if you were to look into the Britannica Encyclopedia, you would get that coat of arms have been used since early medieval Europe, and they were used to establish identity in battle. And when you're trying to establish your identity in battle, you might refer to your line of descent, who you align with, what property you might own, and what profession you might have, things that represent who you are. So even in the imagery that we see today, being a coat of arms in the Commonwealth flag and the seal is a direct tie back to European historical origins. So the point to be made here is to underscore how Councilwoman Solomon stated that the seal is inextricably linked to colonization, and to extend the point that to fully understand a Native person is being used inside of this European colonial symbol. A Native person is being used to represent the state, and of course, what would become the state if we're looking back in time, Mass Bay Colony. In this sense, Native people are being used as a mascot and in a propaganda way. We are now looking today at something that is a direct translation of that. So with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to David.
Thank you, Brittany. Can you hear me, everyone? Yes. So my name is David Detmold, and I live in what is now called the town of Montague, which is right on the banks of the Quinnipiac, or the Connecticut River, just south of what is now called Vermont and New Hampshire. But for 10,000 years, this land, which is unceded land, was a joint resource area that was shared by the Nipmuc people with the Pecumtuck people and the Sokoke people and the Abnaki people. And it was an area where people maintained peaceful relationships, as far as we know, for 10,000 years. Until one day, and that day was May 19th, 1676, a Baptist preacher who had just been let out of jail in Boston to raise a militia to go fight on the frontier of what was a general conflagration that became known as Metacom's War, or sometimes called King Philip's War, the bloodiest per capita war in American history, came to our village, which at that time was a refugee village for mostly old men, women, and children who were trying to escape the conflagration in the heartland of Nipmuc territory and in the coastal lands of the Massachusett and the Wampanoag and the Narragansett, where general warfare had broken out. And so this man, Captain Turner, came to our village and in a surprise attack at dawn, killed hundreds of refugees, old men, women, and children, and did not spare the children. And as history played out, our village became named after him, and our high school became named after him. And then, of course, our sports teams at the high school were named the Indians, in a school named after a man who showed up just for one day and did his best to wipe out every indigenous person that he could find. So this terrible injustice has resonated, throughout the centuries in the way we celebrate our sports teams here in our town, in our school district. And so I worked hard. I was the editor of a little local newspaper called the Montague Reporter, an independent newspaper that I started actually, and which is still doing well. But it seemed to me that this was intolerable. And I got together with some friends on the anniversary of that terrible event, that massacre, and went to the school committee and said, how in the world can this be educationally allowed, that one ethnic group should be stereotyped in the manner that our sports teams so often do? And there was another heated battle took place here in my village over the use of this misappropriation of indigenous imagery in the form of our sports mascot. And our town tends to educate 2 or 3 indigenous children in our school system every year. They're not all going to grow up and be warriors. Some may be poets, some may be scientists, or whatever they choose to be. But we should not teach them from kindergarten on that they are meant to be brave warriors. Do you see my point? And in the midst of these heated discussions, and all the tribal nations from the area sent representatives and said, in no way do we support the continued use of Native American mascots. If you have heroes of your own people, well, then you may feel free to represent them on your sports teams if you wish. But please don't pretend to honor us with a Plains Indian headdress on your sports team's mascot, and tell our children that they are all brave and that they're all meant to be warriors. And in the midst of these heated discussions, one man stood up in the back of the auditorium and said, if we have to change our mascot, why shouldn't the state of Massachusetts have to change theirs? And someone unfurled the flag. And for the first time, we all took a really good, hard look at it, the flag of Massachusetts. And I said to myself back then in 2017, the man's got a really good point. And I've been working to change the state's mascot, the state's seal, if you will, ever since. And so if we could look at the slides very briefly, I'll show you how that image has changed since the Puritans first brought it here. In 1629, they developed this as and we're going to look at this only just very briefly because it is so offensive that we don't want to look at it for too long. But even before they came here, this was the image they brought with them as a commercial enterprise, the Massachusetts Bay Company. And as you can see, it has an indigenous figure in the center with one downward pointed arrow and no quiver. And of course, here there's a speech balloon, if you will, coming out of his mouth saying, "Come over and help us." And so if this is not the definition of white supremacy, I beg you to tell me what is. Next slide, please. Oh, I think I can do this. Okay. So this was the slide until 1684, at which point those of you who know the history of the colony may recall the king revoked the charter. And the reasons for that were many, but established after that in 1685, the Dominion of New England, and put several of the colonies together under this seal. And here again, you can see not only a settler bowing as a subject to his liege lord, but also a native person bearing gifts of the harvest and kneeling before the king, as if native people in 1685 had somehow become subjected to the King of England. You may recall that this will be just less than a decade after Metacom's war, and during this time, native people were being rounded up and shipped off as slaves to the Caribbean, to the Azores, to West Africa, Cadiz in Spain, and particularly the most frightful destination would be the rum plantations and sugarcane plantations in the West Indies, where the mortality rate was so high that a quarter of the slaves who were sent there died every year. And slavery in what we call New England today has a tradition going right back to John Winthrop. As he was building what he considered to be his city on the hill, he had 3 Pequots as personal slaves in his house. So think about this imagery and how it continued to perpetuate this false image and this terrible image, really, that indigenous people were somehow, pacified subjects of the King of England. I'm going to go to the next slide here. There were many other symbols of royal governors, I think 11 who followed, Governor Andros, who was the first, and there were, during this same period of time from 1685 until the Revolutionary War in 1775, I think there were 4 royal seals of the kings, king and queen at one time, William and Mary, and then the George I, George II, and George III. So we're not going to go through all the changes, but we're just going to show you that, in fact, the seal has changed many times, and including during the Revolutionary War period. Here was the state seal. No native imagery. In fact, a white figure carrying the sword for the first time and holding the Magna Carta, because the Magna Carta was the document that at first brought up the idea of no taxation without representation, a very important principle upon which the revolution was fought in Massachusetts. So this symbol here was created by Paul Revere and served what had been the colony of Massachusetts as it fought for 5 years to liberate itself from the King of England, the Crown of England. But then, when that battle was fought and mostly won, Governor John Hancock set up a commission, and it really involved only one person that I can find in the archives of the State House Special Collections Room or in the state archives. A man named Nathaniel Cushing was charged with coming up with something that would be the Massachusetts symbol going forward after the revolution. And this image in its various forms, for the first time we see the sword being placed above the head of an indigenous person as of 1780. And yet you still see an indigenous figure right in the center of this coat of arms, as Brittany pointed out, still carrying that same downward pointed arrow without a quiver of arrows, not a warlike Indian or native person or indigenous person, but from the English or from the revolutionary Americans' point of view, a pacified indigenous person. Okay, so this was represented in many different forms. Here's a particularly frightening one, if you don't mind my saying so. And artists felt free to represent the sword ever larger, looming above the native person's head. Sometimes the bow is in the left hand, sometimes in the right. So finally, the Secretary of State in the late 1880s, 1885, was a man named William Olin, and he endeavored to fix it so that it would always look the same going forward. And he contracted with an illustrator named Edmund Garrett to create what we are looking at today and what we're living under today as our flag, as our seal, and wrapped around the bottom of the shield of the coat of arms is the motto. And that Latin motto is translated generally as, "She seeks a quiet peace under the sword, but peace with liberty." And I want you to just, kind of look at an exploded view of this image for a moment with me. That sword, William Olin specified, should be copied from the sword that is known to or assumed to have been, to the best of our knowledge, carried by Miles Standish, the military commander of the Plymouth colony. And we're going to hear a little bit more about that sword from people who know it well as this presentation goes on. But it is the sword of Miles Standish it was intended to be, and the hand holding it is wearing the ruffled sleeve of a colonial settler. The visage, the facial features, if you will, was taken from a photograph of a Chippewa chief who lived in Montana, not from Massachusetts, but Edmund Garrett considered Chief Little Shell to be, quote, a fine specimen of an Indian. Okay, they patterned the belt that you see in the middle of the native's cloak after what they thought would be a close representation, anyway, of a red flannel belt that Metacom was known to wear in battle. No quiver, just that same arrow pointed downward. And the proportions of the body, as if indigenous people had bodily proportions in some way different from ours, was actually taken from a skeleton of an indigenous person unearthed in the town we now call Winthrop. And the bow was taken from an indigenous person shot and killed by a settler named William Goodnow in Sudbury in 1665, 10 years before the Metacomets War. So when you look at each of these individual elements and then you put them all together, it really is what we call a Frankenstein approach of taking, burial remains and body parts and facial imagery and basically war trophies from the long colonial conquest of indigenous people. And it is a shameful symbol, if you don't mind my saying so. And many people feel that way. And there is a growing effort to change it. And here we see the Ferris Gray, the Sagamore of the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapoag, Elizabeth Solomon's tribe, standing in front of the State House in the year 2020 with a sign whose relevance is as important today as it was 2 or 3 years ago. It is time to change the flag and seal. And with that, I'll turn it back to Brittany.
Thank you, David. If it's possible, yes, to have this slide. Thank you so much. So the next thing that I'd like to talk about is the ubiquity of this imagery in our day-to-day lives. If you are living in Massachusetts, you're going to be quite familiar with this imagery. And I actually was able to take most of these photos, with the exception of the voter information, just today, just easily today. So I wanted to just reflect briefly on what that means. This matters. It matters to everyone, and we see this all of the time. We engage with this imagery all of the time. And considering some of the points that David just made, I think about those things every time that I see this imagery. So let's go over some of them. If we go over to the far left at the top in the gold frame, this is actually an award that was given to my fiance when he was a child. And it's for a great reason. But the point is, the seal is actually featured twice on it. Now, we love to celebrate people here in my family and in my home. So it's in a frame, it's up on the wall. But at the same time, I still see that imagery and it hurts. Now, it makes sense, right? It's on an award that the state is representing itself on. And of course, in our voter information, and when we get our vehicle registrations, and when we have our licenses, these things all make a lot of sense as to why they would be popping into our lives. It's official, it's from the state, makes a lot of sense. It's unfortunate that we have to see it so much, but it's there. However, waltzing into Walmart, there it is. Again, I'm reminded of all of these things and more that Councilwoman Solomon will bring us through in just a bit. And additionally, if you're going to a state school at all in the state, you're going to probably see the imagery on a huge achievement of yours. So, you know, I don't think I'll be buying this frame from my campus bookstore when I finish my graduate degree. So I just wanted to point out and highlight that this is something that everybody engages with, whether we want to or not. Now, I'm going to just move into why it's so frustrating for someone like me to see this, and really go into the aspect of appropriation. So I no longer need the slide, thank you so much. So the first point is that Native people were not consulted when this imagery was created. In fact, the voices of indigenous peoples are only more recently popping up in the historical record, and more recently being, you know, the last 50 years or so. And the voices are calling for change. Now, this is where we have to be very critical. We have to have critical thinking. We have to consider a lot of nuance. We need to identify who is being represented with the current imagery. And we need to locate ourselves individually and as a community when we orient ourselves towards interpreting it. I encourage people to detach themselves from the nostalgic power that this image may have while doing this work. And I say this because I think it's entirely possible for someone to feel very attached to their ideas of what it means to live in Massachusetts, and also to reject how the state was created. In other words, you can love living in Massachusetts, and you can also strive to have compassion and understanding for the land and the people who are native to it. Jim Peters, the chair of the Massachusetts Indian Affairs Commission, who served with Councilwoman Solomon and I on the State Flag Commission, he mentioned that the imagery on the state flag is the history of what happened here. And that's not something that I can argue. It represents genocide and colonization. The history of Massachusetts is a coin with two sides, and on one side we have, as we see in the motto, peace and liberty, the creation of a place where many people currently today are proud to live. And on the other side of that coin, we have a sword. We have a history of genocide and colonization. And as Councilman Solomon mentioned, these things were not a solitary event that is over. The history of living on this land did not have to be a zero-sum game, and yet that is what occurred. Now, being an optimist, I doubt that folks who are proud to live in Massachusetts today want to move forward with a zero-sum game mentality, nor a seal that celebrates those things. Native people living in Massachusetts certainly do not want to see that continue. Councilman Solomon is going to bring us through our next topic, and so I'm going to pass it over to her.
Thanks. And could you bring up the slides, please? Thank you so much. So we're starting here with what David talked about originally, which was the seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony that was actually developed before the colonization of Boston. And as David said, this is something that that the what is it called, the call out, or the words that are coming out of the Native person's mouth say, come over and help us. And I guess I want to kind of think about what does that mean? What was the help that we got? And I think that one of the things to think about is that we know is that one of the things was the a nice way to put it is transfer of land from one community to another. That's the nicest way of putting it. But really it was appropriation of not just land, but a way of life. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, and a lot of these illustrations I'm showing are not so much to depict things accurately, but really to kind of give a little bit of a nuanced sense of how we, as in the dominant culture, really are approaching that interaction between colonists and Native people. And similarly to as what David was talking about in terms of the seal that was of after the charter was revoked, that had a monarch and people bowing before the monarch. Here again, you have most of the people that you see here, with the exception of the Native man who is presumably holding a peace pipe, and potentially the person directly behind him. Everybody that's depicted here is a colonist. And also the colonists are all standing up, while as there's one colonist who's sitting down, but then Native person is sitting down. So really kind of thinking about what that meant. And this is depicting, you know, a agreement between Native peoples and the colonists. And one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that we originally, or still do, have a very different conception of how we interact with the world. And we did not have a conception that land could be owned. So when you're talking about a deed moving, making it actually made land into property, whereas where we were starting, land was not property. So really kind of thinking about like what that means in terms of how that changed our entire ability to, you know, make our living, practice our culture, and others. The thing that you could probably, that most people will point to in terms of being the most, maybe you could say, not altruistic, but at least having some sense of benefit to Native people, was the idea of converting us to Christianity. And some of us did convert to Christianity. However, it was approached from the standpoint of really kind of taking a culture and a faith that was seen to be superior and bringing it to people who were called savages. So really that this came out of a lack of respect. And again, if you look at this image, which is depicting John Eliot, who was one of the people who proselytized to the native peoples, he is standing up. Most of the native people are sitting down. And if you look at the relative space, the relative height of the people, John Eliot is significantly higher in terms of his stature than anyone else in the photo. And this is not photo, the image. And this is another depiction of John Eliot preaching to the Indians, which is was made in 1903. And here it's even more pronounced. Not only is he above everybody, he's standing on a rock above everybody. So that's kind of one thing to kind of think about. Out of this attempt to convert to Christianity, praying towns are established. And these were towns that were set aside for native people who were at least willing to consider converting to Christianity. However, the irony of it is that the praying towns actually removed us from our culture and our beliefs, but did not provide us a mechanism to actually participate in colonial culture. So therefore, we were kind of separated from our own culture, but then not allowed to participate in the culture of the dominant society. And in fact, until I believe it was can't remember the date, but it was less than 30 years ago. It was illegal for a native person to be in Boston without being accompanied by a white person. So that's kind of course, it wasn't enforced, but that shows you the sense of how prominent that idea of separation and superiority was among colonists. One of the things that happened as a result, I'm going to move into King Philip's War and really talk about, which David talked about earlier. And as I said, there were praying towns where people, native people had sometimes voluntarily, sometimes not voluntarily gone. They were separate from English towns. And during King Philip's War, because this was the war that was between some native peoples and the colonists. Keep in mind that the folks in the praying towns had allied with, at least in some manner, with the colonists, were in the process of converting to Christianity, were in the process of adopting colonial ways. However, during King Philip's War, the native people in the praying towns of Natick and Ponkapoag were forcibly removed to the Boston Harbor Islands in the middle of the winter, without food, without shelter, and most of them died. Contrast that with Mary Rowlandson, who is a very famous person who was a captive, quote, captive during King Philip's War, who spent some time with a group of native people. And this was during the winter. Everybody was hungry. Everybody was starving. And one of the things that she said is squaw, and squaw is a Massachusetts and other related language word for women. Squaw gave me some ground nuts, and through the good providence of God, I had comfortable lodging that night. So if you contrast that with what happened to the native people the native people from praying towns that were removed to the Boston Harbor Islands to die. Mary Rowlandson, who was a white woman who had been captive, who was a captive of a group of natives, was taken care of. She was fed, she had lodging. That didn't really help in terms of the way she talked about her experience, but you can, if you read between the lines, you can definitely see that her experience was vastly different than that of the folks that were on the harbor islands. The other thing that continues to happen, and this is sort of around the theme of how colonization continued, the praying towns were administered by colonial guardians, white guardians, and they had complete control over what happened in the towns. And in the sense of continuing to dispossess us from land, the guardians would frequently sell lands to discharge Indian debts. And that sounds like not such a bad thing necessarily, even though the lands were supposed to never be taken away. One of the things that frequently happened is a colonial family or a colonial person would take care of somebody who was a native person who was sick. However, once that person either passed on or got better, they would say they had not been compensated for what they had expended to take care of this person, and therefore land needed to be sold to basically discharge that type of debt. And I'm going to quickly move on to one last thing, which is the scalp bounties. This didn't just happen in New England, it happened all over the country. But it's interesting when people think about scalping, the myth that we have been has been put forward to us is that this was something that Native people did. However, it's not really clear where this started, but if you know the history of the 16th century Europe, it's a pretty brutal place. So it's not inconceivable that this is something that started with the Europeans, but nonetheless, it was the colonists who had actual bounties placed on native scalps, men, women, and children. And this was happening in 1755 and continued to happen for many centuries, or for centuries after this in other parts of the country. So I think one of the things that I want to kind of say again is to kind of think about that this is something, the colonization of this place isn't something, as I said, that happened centuries ago. And so I would say that our examination of our seal and motto must be undertaken within this context of past and present colonization. And I turn it back over to Brittany. I think, no, it's David.
It's me.
You? Okay. Sorry.
So Elizabeth and I are going to pass the microphone back and forth just a little bit to make a few points. These points are not easily discussed. They're hard. They're difficult things to talk about. So moving into what's problematic. I mean, I think we've talked a lot about some things that, make a lot of sense as to why they're problematic. But to be specific, as I mentioned earlier, we are looking at an Indigenous person on a coat of arms. And I hope that I made it very obvious, very clear that that's inappropriate. Really being used as a mascot, as a trophy, as propaganda, and it's just not right. And I also discussed how Native people weren't involved in the creation of that image. And we talked a little bit about the different iterations of it and how it was created. And I believe, David, you mentioned some of this, but I really want to bring some further context to the discussion. So in the New England Magazine, in volume 23 in 1901, in an article titled "The Coat of Arms and Great Seal of Massachusetts," E.H. Garrett discusses the creation of the imagery. And some of these things I'm going to say I'm not too pleased to discuss, but if you don't know, you might want to pay attention to where your jaw is because it's surprising. So one of the things that Garrett discusses is prioritizing, really looking for the earliest authentic description of red men who lived in the old colonial days. This is how we start off as we're discussing the imagery, and there are so many things wrong with this way of thinking. Obviously, we have some terms in there that are inappropriate, but the larger context that I also don't want to lose sight of is that it is people who lived, as if Native people weren't living when this article was written, when the seal was being created and recreated. How could I be here today if we had only lived the way that Garrett discusses? Now we move into a full physical description, riddled with inappropriate terms and phrases of the anatomy of indigenous people. It's almost like listening to Steve Irwin describe a crocodile. We moved forward in an assessment of clothing, and this lens that we're assessing clothing with is through a European lens, and this lens is modesty linked to morale. The idea of an absence of clothing versus a presence of clothing, because the way that Native people dressed was just an absence of clothing, according to European folks. As David discussed, an Indian skeleton from the Peabody Museum at Harvard was used for dimensions. A photo of Little Shell, an Anishinaabe man, is used for the head because, as we discussed, he was a fine specimen of an Indian. And because that tribe is linguistically tied to, the natives that lived here. And also an assessment of Indian postures from the 17th century. So basically, they did everything and anything except consider the fact that Native people were alive, that they could have talked to them, while they were just piecing together this imagery that is a Frankenstein's monster of a Native person. That is in many ways so inappropriate, and it really gets me fired up. It makes my stomach turn. And clearly Native people were not actually included in these discussions. So that is one aspect of what is problematic with the imagery that we're looking at. And Elizabeth, I'm going to hand it back to you for the next few points.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to move through pretty quickly because I see we're kind of taking a little bit more time than we had planned. So one of the most controversial things is actually the sword. And there have been different discussions about the sword, but if you go back to the article that Brittany was talking about, it is clear that incredible effort was made to have the sword be depicting the sword of Miles Standish. There were incredible conversations back and forth between scholars saying, would it be held this way or that way? Was it overhand, underhand? Is this a sword that's appropriate for a stabbing motion or a chopping motion? This seems insignificant or it's kind of silly until you realize the reason they need to know whether it was different between a stabbing or thrusting motion versus a chopping motion is that one of the things that Miles Standish was known for was in the early days of the colony, there was a place which is now called Weymouth, called Massachusett. He basically called to treat or make treaties or talk with a number of Massachusetts men who were, I won't get into the terms, but they were leaders. They were not big, they're not leaders of the entire tribe, but they were leaders of certain parts of the tribe. They were known for their fierceness. They were known for their bravery. They were known for being strong. Under the auspices of treating with these men, Standish and his men actually cut off their heads, brought them back to Plymouth, put them on a spike, and left them there for decades. So the fact that they had to think about, well, is it a chopping or a stabbing motion, really kind of talks about that they understood not only what he did, but that it was important for them to get it right. So that, I don't know about you, but that is incredibly stomach churning to me. And I turn it back to Brittany.
There we go. So if we think about that and we reflect on the motto, by the sword we seek peace, but peace only liberty. The question has to be, from whose perspective? Whose peace? Whose liberty? Who is thinking that way? I'm not. And it really, I hope it resonates with people when you consider the story that we just heard. And then consider what the motto is and the imagery. And I don't want to take too much time because that's really straightforward from me. But I think if before David takes it away, I think it would be not my place to discuss the name of the state.
Oh, I'm sorry. That was one of the things I was trying to move quickly. And so one of the other things that's interesting is that even though we're talking about incredible brutality, and this was true with, although there are a lot of stories between the around mythology that the relations between Native peoples and the colonists were at least initially peaceful. That was never true for the Massachusetts. This thing that happened in the early 1600s. And the thing that's really ironic is that the name Massachusetts itself is taken from the Massachusett Tribe. So we're kind of talking, that goes back to the appropriation that Brittany was talking about, that that the state, the Commonwealth, has taken the name of people that they have brutalized in the past. And so that is just another thing. Not that I think we should change the name, but I'm just kind of saying, I'm just really kind of thinking about the layers of both brutality, colonization, appropriation, all of which are combined in this flag in a way that is pretty profound. And now we go back to David.
Okay, thank you. And I do know we're pushing the time frame here beyond where we had promised to entertain your questions and answers, so I'll be very quick in saying there's a movement to change this symbol, and you've heard all the good reasons why it should be changed. And I just want to let you know that I've learned a lot in the 8 years that I've been working on this, that indeed indigenous leaders have been pushing for this symbol to be changed for at least 50 years. And for the past now 40 years, when John Slow Turtle Peters, medicine man of the Mashpee Wampanoag, worked with the great African-American legislator and civil rights icon from Boston, Byron Rushing, to introduce a bill in 1985 to set up a special commission. It took the Massachusetts majority white legislature 32 years to pass even that simple measure, to set up the special commission that Elizabeth Solomon and Brittany Wally and 4 other leaders of the Wampanoag and Jim Peters himself, the director of the Commission on Indian Affairs, have been kind enough to serve on as volunteers, not getting paid to do this. But it took the legislature 32 years to even set up a commission to finally sit down with Native leaders and consult them about the terrible misappropriation of their imagery and all the horrible details that we've gone through. And that commission, the Republican governor that preceded Maura Healey, it took him, 9 months to even seat the 19-member commission. They were supposed to be done with their work and reporting back to the legislature by October of 2021. Governor Baker didn't even appoint them all until November of 21. The legislature gave them no money to work with. And still, the 6 indigenous leaders of that commission pushed for and gained an entire consensus among the 19 members, including some fairly stalwart opponents of changing the flag and seal, if you don't mind my saying so, or certainly people who would not ever admit that the intended to demean or harm Native people, as if they couldn't even see the origins of it come over and help us. And they did gain a consensus and a unanimous vote in May of last year that a total revision was necessary. And in December, that commission issued unanimous findings that a total revision was necessary and that Massachusetts should educate people about the harm the symbol has caused, which the Partnership of Historic Bostons is doing the work that the legislature itself should be doing tonight. And I'll just say that for my part, having taken to heart what was said in that meeting regarding the changing of our high school mascot, that the state needed to change theirs, and the way I've been working at it, I was elected to be a town meeting member in my town, so I took this issue to one town meeting after another, first starting with 4 little towns right around Montague, including one that had voted in the majority for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton. And Orange, Wendell, Gill, and New Salem all voted in 2018 to change the flag and seal. And they have since been joined by now 53 other cities and towns. May we see the map just briefly, Gina, of the progress we have made in bringing this to city councils and town meetings. And while she's getting that map available to you on the shared screen, I just want to say that there are now at least 24 other town meetings preparing to vote. And many people who are working on that are here with us tonight, listening to the wisdom that Elizabeth Solomon and Brittany Wally are sharing with us. And, I want to say with a certain amount of shame that it was not until these white majority towns really began to weigh in and demand that this change occur. Even though indigenous leaders have been asking for this for 50 years and more, I'm sure, it was only when, the white majority of the society and the towns began to say, do this needs to be done, that the legislature finally began to take action. And by no means is it a done deal that this flag and seal will be changed. And we need everyone who's watching this show, this Zoom meeting tonight, to take a hand in this effort. And I just want to end my part of this discussion by going back to a meeting that Brittany Wally was part of way back in 2020, when the discussion of the flag and seal and Native American mascots was being hosted by the Okateo Center here in my part of the state in Ashfield. And she said, you know, this terrible misappropriation of our imagery is ongoing, and we, you know, Native people have to appear at these meetings to continue to describe why this is wrong and why this needs to change. But it's even offensive that we have to do that because we have already spoken. You just haven't listened. So Brittany, I'll give it back to you now.
I still can't believe that was 3 years ago. Thank you, David. So to kind of wrap up, I have a thought experiment, and I hope to make it somewhat quick. So if we were to imagine just for a moment that we were coming up for the very first ever seal motto imagery representation of our community, people living in the state of Massachusetts, what would we come up with to represent ourselves? And in this thought experiment, no one would be tethered to past imagery, but simply just asking right now, what would you come up with? I hazard to suggest that respect for the past and honoring of how things have come to be, combined with who we are now and where we want to go, make up an excellent foundation for imagery that a community could use in self-representation. In this thought experiment, I would be cautious to remember that imagery is simply imagery. It doesn't have much power if it doesn't represent something in the real world. So if I had to answer the question, I would be basing my answers off of principles that move the imagery away from being simply performative. Many of the things that I personally would like to see happen in my lifetime relate directly back to unfinished business that the state has with my tribe and sister tribes. In a drastically abbreviated list, such things would include land back movements, return of historic belongings, return of ancestors that lay in wait in museum collections, an increase in understanding by the general public of indigenous histories, an increase in informed and compassionate allies, and a decrease in forces that continuously cause various struggles that indigenous peoples here in the Commonwealth have to face on a daily basis. So with that being said, I could hypothetically then, in this thought experiment, see the aspirations of the future that I hope for. And at the same time, I can recognize the reality that I live in presently. And I could contextualize the path that has led us here from the past. With these things in mind, combined with some harm reduction protocol, I would be able to describe to you images that I think represent these 3 periods in time and thus my community in Massachusetts. I'm not going to get into what these images would be because, to be honest, I think some statewide surveying needs to happen and I am just one person. But I would doubt that we would come up with imagery that would place indigenous people in the same precarious and dangerous situation that we see in the current imagery. In fact, I think we can assess the question, how do we want to represent ourselves externally, by quickly looking over at how the tourism works in our state. We've moved far from making it seem as though Native people are asking for help. Now we entice people to put money into our community by saying, we have a little bit of everything. It's one of our slogans, if you didn't know, in the tourism section, a little bit of everything. Clearly, we're not enticing people to come and visit so they can perpetuate forced assimilation and genocide of Native people. Another place where we represent ourselves to others far and wide, as far as you can go in a car at least, is on our license plates. In Massachusetts, you know, to everyone else, we claim that we are the spirit of America. So if this is how we see ourselves, as a leader, as the spirit, perhaps as an example for the rest of the country, then right now we are currently a poor example of what it means to include indigenous voices in the representation of these lands and what has happened here. But that can change. And we need to keep making that change together. Kadabadamish, thank you.
Thank you all, David and Elizabeth and Brittany, for sharing your time with us tonight and sharing your emotions and the strength that it takes to move forward with this issue. We have about 15 minutes for questions, and I want to kind of take a few questions that have been in the chat and I'm hope to present them as one, which is what, recently in the last 4 years, not in what we think of as the misguided past, but right now, has been the main argument against changing it. When you run into opposition, what is that opposition? That it's not necessary, that it's not so bad, that it would just be too hard to think of something else? And then is it the case that what the legislature has done is kind of move this into a referendum where we'll just let each town decide and we'll go by majority rule? So what has been the recent opposition and what is the path it's on right now with all these towns voting? What will that do?
David,
This is-
no, go ahead, Brittany.
Oh, okay. Well, just to kind of get our toes, wet. One thing that I don't look always to see all the negativity, but people just don't think it matters. Why are we going to waste this or that, energy and resources into something? It doesn't matter. And I think as we discussed, it's everywhere in our daily lives and it does matter. And if we want to think of ourselves as a community, then I think it should matter. And for all the other reasons that we said, it matters. So I think one of the big things, this is maybe more general and not very exciting, but people just don't care.
And what is the path that it's on? What are towns exactly voting for?
Cities and towns are telling their own state legislators, the ones who represent their own communities, that they're tired of flying this flag and they want their state legislators to change it. The most common argument I hear against that in town meetings is people standing up and saying, you're trying to change our history. And we respond to that by saying, unfortunately, we cannot change our history, our violent history. But we can change our future relations with the people who have stewarded this land for 10,000 years and more. And we desperately need to open up a better dialogue with them on grounds of respect and honor for the stewardship of the land that we have so badly taken care of in the 400 years of this colonial experiment.
So if every town voted for this, what would happen?
The legislature would be very embarrassed to continue flying that flag if every city and town in Massachusetts said they're sick of it and they're done with it. And
but it wouldn't actually change it. The legislature would have to vote
up to the legislature.
Okay.
And we want them to move.
Okay. So before the session ends, and in fact, maybe at 8:20, I'm going to put a series of links into the chat. And 3 of them are links to where you can get involved and you can see your town and you can learn how to influence your town's vote and get involved in other ways. Okay, and then someone is asking, we get why the seal was created when colonization was still going on, because it was sending a message of our colonization is successful. Look how we have subjugated these people. Once we have the United States and Massachusetts as a state, someone is asking, why was this even continued? Like, I guess every state has a seal, but do you have any information on why there wasn't another major rethink? David showed us one where during the revolution, it showed a sturdy colonizer. Just a brief note on, why it reverted back to something from the colonizing period.
Well, I want to kind of say, reiterate one of the things that I said is that the colonizing period is not over. Colonization is still happening.
Right.
And a lot of the myths about the founding of the country that we have play into that. And so I mean, can I go back and think about what's in the minds of somebody in the 1880s? No clue. But I do kind of feel like I think one of the things that is really important is not to think about colonization in the past. Colonization continues. Unfortunately, we don't have time to kind of go into like ways to illustrate, how that shows up. But again, it's like the idea of, it's like we have been, in a sense, we have been either eliminated or assimilated, and this is a sense of the continuing power of the dominant society over us.
Someone else is asking, are there any examples that you know of other states that have successfully changed their emblems, their seal or their flag emblems?
There are definitely other examples out there. I've experienced folks really trying to make some comparisons that don't actually exist, but that's just to say I don't think there's a perfect formula out there. But as far as examples of change and positivity and moving forward, one really beautiful thing that actually happened, it was right in the town of Mashpee when they redesigned their town seal. It's gorgeous, and it speaks to the history of that localized area. And it's, it's not just gorgeous, it's respectful. It really does a great job, I think. And the way that people were involved and engaged, the whole process was really meaningful for me to learn about. I would definitely look into all of that if you were, interested in trying to look at lateral, comparative examples. But also it's hard to make comparisons to other states because we do have a specific history here.
All right. Someone points out that David's concluding thoughts led them to an interesting thought, which is when we talk about trying to change our flag, you've really raised, questions about, how united as a people living within a manufactured state actually is going to be. Of course, working to create something better and inclusive could perhaps generate that sense of us and our, but that's why it's like change the flag and seal, not change our flag. How often does that come up?
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I would say we have to do it as a we. We have to do it as a we. We all live here. Indigenous, non-Indigenous, immigrants, folks who, do not have citizenship and are discriminated against because of that. There is no way forward unless it is a we. This flag that we have now was not a we. And we need that. If we cannot do it together, then it's not going to be successful.
And a couple of people are asking, what is the work that you, Brittany and Elizabeth, are involved in right now with the commission? What phase is it in?
What phase is it in? I was waiting for the,
like
the contextualizing
what are all the things
question.
to do? Like, obviously this has been going on for a long time.
Oh, right. So in just the past December, we had to submit our findings, and I think there was a lot of, confusion, misunderstanding going into the work, and a lot of interesting expectations from everyone across the board. But and you can see this if you want to watch the last recording of this special commission to really see what I'm talking about here. But we did submit our report, and it really is framed as initial findings because truly the work can't end here. It really wasn't able to be completed with the time that we had and the energy and efforts that we had. So I would hate to speak for more than myself because I just I like to think about that responsibility, but the main feeling is it's definitely work that's not completed yet, but that was our report that was submitted. At this point in time, I'm personally waiting and hoping to see when and how the commission will be revived so we can continue and we can finish doing what we started.
David,
right.
I think you
Okay.
have some information in terms of what's happening in the legislature now. Right now, the commission is no longer active because our term has expired. We do not feel like our work is done. I don't think anyone on the commission feels like our work is done. So we are hoping that the legislature will reactivate us. But that's not up to us. That's up to the legislature.
Legislature did finally give $100,000 to the special commission to spend on holding listening sessions around the state and the polling, the surveying that Brittany mentioned, and perhaps to commission artwork as a mock-up of a possible design, the aspirational elements that Brittany was talking about. And they gave that money to the commission in the middle of November of last year, but they failed to give them an extension on their time, which ran out in December. So they didn't have time to spend the money. I talked to one commissioner who said it was almost as if the legislature had set us up to fail. However, looking and positively, that same commission member told me just about a week and a half ago when Andre Strong-Bearhart Gaines came and gave a great presentation about Nipmuc cultural values in my little village. He was there, Commissioner Brian Boyles, if I may quote him, and he said that an extension on the timeline for the special commission has been folded into a supplemental budget that the House has approved and that is pending in the Senate, and it may be passed any day now. And we are certainly encouraging everyone who's listening tonight to tell their legislators to make that happen.
Yes, that is one way to make it our campaign to change our feel, is if we all get involved. And I have been putting those links into the chat.
Yep.
First three are places where you can go to start getting involved and to learn more. A lot of people really want details on where the process is in the commission and all of that. It's all there in those first three links. So go and visit those. Oh, and someone does ask, what is the name of the bill if you were looking that up? And I'm sure it's on one of the websites. Is it just a number?
It's just the supplemental budget is what it's called. And everyone knows because they're trying to refund things, very important things like SNAP benefits that have expired. But tucked away in there is a little line item to give Elizabeth, Brittany, and their colleagues, until November, the end of November of this year, to complete their work, and they need that time. And we as a Commonwealth, the we that Elizabeth talked about, we need that to happen. And by the way, we should not let our new governor off the hook here. She could retire this flag tomorrow by executive order and tell the legislature to come up with a new design, and we should ask her to do so.
I also just wanted to I don't think we talked about this at all, but I don't know if there's a link on this, but I think there's also the Mass Indigenous, what's it called, David? It's in terms of the group of bills.
Legislative agenda.
Brittany.
Yeah.
That link is there.
Yeah, and so I would encourage people to look at that because I know a lot of times people want to know what they can do. And that is something, there are a number of bills that are pending in the legislature that address issues that are important to Indigenous folks and that have been approved by the Indigenous folks.
I just put that link in, which I got from Brittany. So
yes, the sign and send.
Just went up.
Can you summarize? Can you summarize those 5 bills, Brittany? Very important.
5 bills in
2
50
minutes?
seconds.
No.
Well, I would definitely first point to if you want to, you should go to the MA Indigenous Legislative Agenda. You should go there because that website does in fact go over all of the bills that this sign and send form urges people to sign and send about. So This is really a lot for the pressure is on. So these topics are about celebrating and teaching Native American culture and history, educating Native youth, the Indigenous Peoples Day bill, protecting Native American heritage, it's another bill, the Native Mascot bill, and those are things that would be their individual bills that are not rolled into the budget or anything else. The bill that we're talking about to extend our special commission is not on the Massachusetts Indigenous Legislative Agenda website, but those other bills are. So that's a very poor description of what's on that website. But I do really encourage people to go there and explore for themselves.
And people have those URLs now, and we are just 1 minute away. So I want to, before we all get thrown out of this Zoom, thank you so much again, David and Brittany and Elizabeth, for sharing your time and your spirit with us tonight. We have all learned so much, and we are taking away actions that we can take in our town. Look at your town seal, look at your town high school, look at your state, and look at your favorite big league sports team. And there's actions you can take really at every level. And if you want to see a little more about any of these things, you can come to the Partnership of Historic Boston's website at historicbostons.org. I'll put that in there too. And see what other events we have coming up and all the other things that we have happening. But for tonight, thanks once again to our three speakers and to all of you for participating. And good night to you all.